Hi, this is Lisa Marriott. I teach qualitative methods for health professionals here at Oregon Health and Science University in the OHSU PSU School of Public Health. We've been teaching this class for several years now, and there's this process of going through the coding of qualitative data that can create some self-doubt as to whether you're doing it correctly. And one of the students described it as feeling like they're making a basket, and you have all of these raw materials in the very beginning as part of their data, and it's really unclear as to whether you're creating the basket in this correct way, because at some point there are these pieces sticking out all over the place, and am I even doing this right? So this is why we're doing this video. I like to think of it a lot as a puzzle. So as you're starting to code, you can think about it as if you were doing a jigsaw puzzle. Like, you could take all of the pieces and you could code them maybe by color, or by edge pieces first versus non-edge pieces in the beginning, or if they had faces, or if they have words, or based on their location around the globe. The process doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is that systematic approach of how you're going about to make sense of these individual pieces of the data. As you're thinking about how to code, there are theories for doing this. And so you'll hear about these different approaches. So you could do it in a deductive, where you have ideas of what things are going to be. It may come up from the data as more inductive. Content analysis is really, really common. And so is thematic analysis. So these are overall themes or overall things that are, in the data, the content of the data. There's also discourse analysis. So saying ums in work, or within social media, looking at how people are speaking is going to be important. There's also grounded theory, where you're going back and forth between theory and practice to really understand whether a theory can be applied to a certain population. Either way, you're going to probably be picking some sort of approach based on what is suiting your research question. So again, it's all going to come down to what are you trying to show with your research data, or what are you trying to ask of your research data. When you're thinking about the steps of coding, it's really important to start by reading and ideally rereading some of your transcripts. And this process can seem kind of frustrating because you want to get on with it, but I highly encourage you to take the time to do this step, because you'll have a much better sense of what your data will include. So you can start to develop your codes that are more thoughtful and representative of your data. When you start to develop your codes, you might have some ideas of what they're going to include. So for example, if you're thinking about, like, how do people commute to work, for example, you might have some preconceived ideas that, okay, maybe people are transporting themselves by, maybe by bike, or by train or bus, or even by car. So those are things that, they're top down. You have an idea of how this works. But, the data, some things are also going to come out of the data, emerging from the data. So for example, somebody might kayak to work, and this is something that you might not have expected. So rather than be very, very literal and code as a separate kayak, and this is one person of all of your sample, it might be more representative to think about what your research question is. So maybe you don't necessarily care about the literal way people get to work, but maybe you care about whether they are self-powering themselves to work, or if they're being passively transported by, say, train or car. Or maybe your research question really cares about the differences between public versus private transportation. So if you're talking about private transportation, you might code bike and kayak and car together. So again, it's going to be highly dependent on what you're trying to understand. You're going to have some codes, and you may also have subcodes. So these are typically called parent codes or child codes. So for example, you might have, barriers to accessing health services, and that might be the parent code. And under that, you might have structural barriers or emotional barriers. So you have two child codes under that. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you go about coding your data. But regardless, you're going to create a code book, and this gives the definitions. It says a coding dictionary of what it includes and what it might exclude. So what wouldn't be included into that code. And it also provides some sample codes. So someone could pick up your work, even if they've never done it before, and look at your code book and apply these codes to excerpts that they read. So here's an example of one of our project's data dictionary. So this is when we were looking at public perceptions of predictive cancer genetic testing. And what we found is that people generally want to their reasons are either benefiting self or benefiting society. And so one of the themes that we've noticed is benefiting self doesn't only include themselves, but also their family and children. So we describe that as one of the definitions. As you're processing through all of this information, there's an iterative process that happens. So you're going to be adding codes or deleting codes, and you may actually even be merging some of these pieces. So you're going to want it, this is iterative categorization, and you want to generally develop some sort of audit trail so people can follow your work and you can go back to understand exactly what was changed and when. As an example of an iterative coding process, this is from the same study, when we were developing this, we had these sub-themes in green as different codes. And so people would describe, the information that they would need in order to participate in genetic research. And, they might describe, like, well, how much do I need to travel? Or, what is the actual risk or process that I would be going through? Or who are the people that are doing the data? Or when will I find out my results? And originally these things were separate, but as we were going through, we realized that these are things that are typically found on consent forms during the informed consent process. So for us, it made more sense to condense these sub-themes into a main theme of consent form considerations. It better described what we were trying to say, and it helped future researchers better describe what would be needed or what would be included when they try to inform individuals about participation in genetic testing, for example. One of the benefits of qualitative research is that it's really helpful to have a team to help you, especially when you have diversity on your team, people who can read these excerpts from different perspectives and coming together to really agree on that, well, this is what this means and this is what this means. And coming up with these definitions together, because we all have implicit biases that may make us read things in a certain way and understand them or interpret them in a certain way that someone else may interpret in a different way. So working together can help you have a better perspective about what the data are actually describing. So you can do this in a group process where you can actually project the excerpts onto a projector, onto a screen, and you can go through the excerpts together. Or you might develop the code book together and apply some of those excerpts. The other way that you can do it is through blind coding, where everyone's working individually, and then you're coming back together to really describe and look at the codes and make sure that you are each coding the same excerpt in the same way. So you can use percent agreement or inter-rater reliability to compare how you are coding compared to another individual. So coding is an iterative process as you're going through. So when you're coding your data, take notes on what you're observing. This might give you some really good insight as you're starting to analyze your data later. You might look for things that support what you're trying to show, and also look for counterexamples, things that would be the opposite of that. So it's important to look for both sides. And we also highly encourage you to use the great quotes as a co-code. So for example, you could code for benefiting society. And if someone might say something that really illustrates better than any of these other quotes, this is what I'm trying to say when I say benefit society. So by co-coding it with a new code called Great Quotes, it allows you to find it more easily so you can place it into your publications later. You're going to use some of these guiding principles, and these are ways that you can increase the rigor and reproducibility of your work. You want to be very systematic and transparent about your approaches when you're coding your qualitative data. This is very important because it really allows people to follow your thought process as you're going through, and it helps to really increase your ability to be methodical and have valid and reproducible results. Dr. Adrienne Zell created this slide, which I really appreciate because it shows different approaches that you could use to increase the validity or reliability of your work. You don't need to use all of them, but all of these are really great tools that you can use to increase the reproducibility and reliability. We often get questions from students about how many levels of codes they should have, and typically 1 or even 2 levels, the parent and child codes, is sufficient. You don't need to have large nested data sets because it makes it really hard to do inter-rater reliability to make sure that everyone is coding correctly. Often when you're also coding and you're using software, there are ways that it will allow you to recode or merge things more easily, which makes things a lot easier. We often get asked of how many codes students should have in their projects. So you might have between 20 and 80. That is a lot of codes to apply, especially like if you're trying to keep them all situated. Like, how are you going to remember 80 codes and be able to apply them consistently? So it might be 5 to even 20 is a good number for some of these early projects. And again, you're going to be thinking about whether you actually have enough of a sample to warrant a code. Like, and you can think back to like the kayak example, or if there's a better concept that might be more appropriate for now. We often get asked if they should start coding early. Can they start before they collect their finish collecting their data? And the answer is yes, but especially primarily for the purpose of developing your code book. You don't want to get so far down the road where now you have new codes that are developed, and now you have to go back to the original, the early ones that you started by coding, and then you have to apply all new codes. So be very methodical as you go through to make sure that you're coding all phases of your data collection in the same way. You can use old school ways of highlighters or even cutting pieces of paper out and sorting them into groups, or even Word or Excel. You don't need fancy coding software in order to do this, but you can. So Deduce or Atlas TI and Vivo, they all have approaches that allow you to quantify the excerpts and the codes that you are developing. But however you do it, make sure that you trust yourself as you're going through, especially in the beginning. There's so much self-doubt about whether you're doing it right, and that being methodical in your approach, how the process that you're applying, the ways that you're adding or deleting or changing or merging, being really transparent about that process is going to help inform your research project. It's going to make things more rigorous and reproducible for future researchers who might follow your work. And it really helps to create a better research study where you feel confident in the results that you're producing. So trust yourself, have fun, and it's an iterative process.